You're listening to Conversations on Communication, produced in collaboration with the University of Queensland. I'm David Gilchrist. In this episode, we are looking through a crisis lens. Effective crisis communication is essential when business and government are faced with a situation that has the potential to unsettle, even ruin their normal operation. Managing Director of Crisis Communications Specialist Agency Insignia, Jonathan Hemus, works with leaders of business globally to ensure they have the capability and confidence to do and say the right things under the intense pressure of a crisis. During his 25-year career, he has advised clients including Anglo American, Cathay Pacific, Disney, DP World, the International Cricket Council, Lidl, Procter Gamble and Sky. Jonathan is a regular media commentator on breaking crises for media including the BBC, CNN, Management Today, the Sunday Times and the Wall Street Journal. And he joins us now. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, David. Good to be here.
What drew you into crisis communications?
I don't think anybody sets out in life to be a crisis communication or a crisis management consultant, and I certainly didn't. I guess there were two or three things that drew me in that direction. Firstly, as I got to be a teenager and then moved on to university, I recognised that there were three things in terms of a career that I was really looking for. One was something that involved communication. I love communicating. I'm fascinated by it. It also had to involve and be focused on people. And I also have a deep interest in business. So my role had to ultimately be about business, people, and communication. And I think crises are when those three things all come into very sharp focus. And so I was lucky enough, having started my career in traditional PR, corporate communication, about 10 years into my career, having done a little bit of crisis comms, to join a big consultancy who was looking for a new head of their crisis and issues practice. And that was my big break in terms of crisis management. I did that for 10 years. Then decided I wanted to really specialize and form a business which only did crisis communication. And that was how Insignia came into being 15 years ago.
Wow, what a journey. Now, someone once said to me that crisis communications managers or crisis managers are probably the loneliest people in the world because no one wants to know, right, until the wheels fall off whatever the project or the business is. Is that how the corporate world regards crisis communications?
It's a really great question. I have had people say to me and to other clients who specialize in crisis management, we kind of never want to see you because it usually means bad news. Conversely, actually, when the crisis is happening, you are welcomed in with open arms. And I think particularly on the client side as well, it's when the communicators actually have the greatest influence and can make the biggest difference. And that's another reason why I love doing what I do, because of the difference it makes. What I'd also say, joking aside, is that those leaders who don't want to think about crisis ahead of crisis and don't want to hear about or consider the possibility of bad things happening, those are the leaders that I really worry about. And they're also the leaders whose organizations are most likely to falter in a crisis. In an absolute worst case, they are the kind of leaders that create a culture in which crises are more likely because they don't want to hear bad news. Therefore, when there are maybe just the first rumblings of something going wrong, everybody's too scared to raise a hand up and say there's a problem here. So I would say this, wouldn't I? But I believe it's true. The most enlightened leaders and the ones whose businesses are the most crisis proof are the ones that are willing to consider the worst case, the ones that are prepared to invest time and money in planning for the worst. What that means is they're going to prevent many of the situations that would otherwise happen. And worst case, they're going to be right ready to respond if it doesn't. As a quick aside on that, I'm halfway through listening to an audio book called Flying Blind, which is about Boeing, and in particular the 737 MAX crashes. And this is all about how the culture of an organization can create the conditions for a crisis. And that certainly was one of the significant contributory factors to the awful events that happened to the Boeing 737 MAXes, and then the incredible fallout and damage that the organization itself has suffered.
I'll come back to that analogy shortly. When you were talking about sort of preparing, why isn't it enough for a company to say, well, look, our crisis strategy will be this. We'll have the CEO and a couple of assistants nut out a few lines. This is, showing us the way to the exits, and that'll do. What's wrong with that as a strategy? Won't that do?
No, it won't do. The more you do beforehand, the better you will be able to respond. So in simple terms, it is about, first of all, it's first of all about having that crisis resistant culture that I talked about. First of all, it's about having the mindset that is prepared to conceive of crises and that wants to be alerted when bad news is brewing. Secondly, it is about developing a plan, a way of working to respond. And working in a crisis is different to working in a business as usual situation. Clearly, there are enormous pressures on the individuals involved in that response. Clearly, there are incredibly high stakes for the people who've been affected by the crisis, for the leaders of the business, for their employees, for reputation, for business value. And under those circumstances, adrenaline flows, the amygdala part of the brain starts pulsing, and without a well-conceived plan and a way of working that works in crisis, not business as usual, bad decisions will be made, people may be paralyzed by inaction, and the crisis will just get worse. People need to be trained because it's a different way of working. They need to learn the skills and the ways of operating successfully in a crisis. And critically, they need to rehearse. One of the first reasons for rehearsing is that all of the flaws that will, of course, be present will only be revealed through rehearsal. And of course, if you don't rehearse, they will only be revealed through a live experience when you find out that you haven't got the contact details for all of your customers that you need to notify about the cyber breach, or you do, but you hadn't figured out that if all of our systems are down, we can't email them. So we need to find a different way of communicating with them. So rehearsal is firstly the way of identifying the gaps, flaws that need to be addressed. Secondly, it is about ingraining that way, that special way of working in a crisis within the team. And thirdly, it's about giving people the confidence that they can do it. Hoping that you can wing it is an optimistic strategy, I would suggest.
So I guess in very general terms, a crisis communication strategy has a before, during, and after elements. Mm-hmm. Is it true that the after, the stuff that you do after the dust is settled, is potentially the most important aspect?
But gosh, that's another very good question, because all three are very important. What you do beforehand is critically important for the reasons that I just explained, because if you haven't put the work in beforehand, you may survive and you may do the right things, but it is a very high risk strategy. So what you do beforehand is critically important. What you do in the immediate moment of the crisis is also critically important. And actually what you do in the first hours is probably the most important of all. Certainly if this is a crisis which is in the public domain. Some of them at the beginning play out behind closed doors because people these days, I believe, largely judge organizations not on the fact of having a crisis, but on how they respond to it. If we take cyber as the example, I think it's pretty clear that whoever you are, however big you are, however well run you are, no organization can be completely immune from a cyber attack. So an organization that suffers a cyber incident, it's unlikely they're going to be pilloried simply for the fact of the attack, unless they've been really careless in terms of their security. What they will be pilloried for is a really poor response to it. So I think doing and saying the right things, particularly in the first few hours or days in a long-lasting crisis of the crisis breaking, has a significant influence on how the organization will be perceived. And I guess, therefore, to answer your question, David, if the organization has either got their planning wrong or their immediate response wrong, or both, what they do in the recovery phase is actually far less important, because the damage will be so significant if they've messed up both of those first two parts, that the recovery bit is going to be so hard, and it may be an impossible task that they're taking on there. If they haven't messed up the first two phases, then absolutely the third one is critically important. But yeah, I think the first two are critical.
We work in this fast-paced digital world, and communications is supposed to be easier, but in some ways it's got a lot harder. A recent study found that false news online reaches people about 6 times faster than the truth, and falsehoods are 70% more likely to be retweeted on Twitter than the truth. What are the key aspects of crisis communications, especially in this fast-paced digital world where misinformation spreads faster and lasts longer than the truth?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think communication is harder now than it ever was. I think there's more opportunities to communicate, but cutting through is a lot harder. When I first started, working in this area 25 years ago, we were talking about, getting your statement out in time for it to be on the 9 o'clock news in the evening, or in time for it to be in tomorrow's newspapers. I mean, literally 25 years ago, that's what we were talking about, and clearly that is now ancient history. I think what I would say is that, particularly with fake news and social media and AI and the pace of everything these days, the first thing is it's important to build up trust beforehand. So the proactive communication that you do before a crisis, the relationships that you build to give you that bedrock of trust, is a really valuable asset in a crisis, because you need to have that credible, trusted voice in a crisis, so that among all the other voices, when you as an organization go out and say something, the people hearing that message believe it, because you have earned your spurs beforehand. Second thing I'd say is, because of all the factors that we've just mentioned, it makes that speed of response so much more important. You can't ever go out and say something of which you are not 100% certain. The last thing you should be doing is speculating or saying something that you believe is true but may not be. But equally, you need to get your voice into the narrative as quickly as possible. So build trust beforehand and be ready to communicate quickly. And as a real practical point, what that means is, and again, this comes back to the planning phase, knowing how you are going to communicate quickly under pressure. And it may well require a shortening, for example, of your normal approval processes, because If it normally takes 3 layers and the lawyers 2 days to approve, you're going to have lost the battle before you've got that statement out. It's also why it's important to do your scenario planning in advance. Cyber again, at what point would we communicate? Think about it beforehand. Don't wait for that pressurized moment before discussing it.
You're listening to Conversations on Communication. I'm David Gilchrist, and I'm talking with internationally respected crisis communication expert Jonathan Hemus from high-profile agency Insignia. Now, let me ask you about one crisis. 9 years ago, and just past the anniversary actually, Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 disappeared without a trace while flying from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. The plane's disappearance sparked an unprecedented global search into one of the great mysteries of the modern age. The families of those missing complained about the lack of transparency and timely information. So what does this example tell us about what may have been needed there in that crisis for Malaysian Airlines?
So there are a number of strands there, David. I think one is think the unthinkable. In your planning, plan for the absolute worst case. So, for example, another tragedy involving aeroplanes, of course, was 9/11. Have a good colleague and peer, Gus Whitcomb, who was head of crisis management for American Airlines on 9/11, and he talks about what that felt like and the fact that their plans had in them a number of things that they couldn't do on 9/11. For example, number one, fly to the scene of the crash. Number two, get communication out immediately. Well, number one, they couldn't do because all aircraft were grounded. Number two, they couldn't communicate quickly because the White House told them not to. And number three, all of their plans were based on one airplane crashing, not more than one. Therefore, their plans were not all that helpful for what had actually happened. So, two strands coming out of that. Think the unthinkable, and also have crisis management plans which are about the way that you work, not very tightly defined checklists or playbooks. I'm not suggesting there shouldn't be, in addition, checklists for particular crisis types, but if your crisis communication or crisis management plan is limited to very tightly defined crises, then it will not serve you well. Second observation in terms of the Malaysian Airlines crash is simply how challenging crisis management is. And in particular, I think understanding and again, mapping out in advance the interrelationships of all of the different parties that will be involved in responding to that crisis. Don't take a singular organization specific approach. What do I mean? What I mean is, with that particular incident, you had multiple governments involved, obviously Malaysia, but also governments from the countries where the victims lived. You, of course, had emergency services, you had accident investigators, you had Malaysian Airlines themselves, you, of course, had the media, whole range of different stakeholders. Work out who you might well be, working with ahead of the crisis. Equally, and in fact, more importantly, in a crisis of that kind, and again, this is something that Gus would say, caring for the people who have been harmed by this crisis, the family members, is probably your number one priority. And as a broader rule, one good tip that I would give to your viewers and listeners would be, you never have enough time to do everything you would like to do in a crisis, and you are unable to communicate equally with every stakeholder group. In any crisis, work out who is the number one most important stakeholder group, and focus disproportionate attention on them. Which is the group of people who are most impacted by this, or which is the group of people that have most influence over how this situation plays out? And make your decisions and prioritize your communication based on that understanding. I think the final thing I'd say on Malaysian Airlines, and again, it's a broader point, also never underestimate the criticality of internal communication in a crisis. Keeping your own people well informed and having them as ambassadors speaking on behalf of the business in a crisis can be really powerful. So yeah, a huge tragedy, an iconic crisis, and many learnings coming out of it.
When you talk about that sort of situation, and as you were talking just now, one of the things that seemed to come out of what you were saying was, in order to help decide who your key stakeholders should be, is it true that what you should be doing is leaning into your core values?
100%, David. Yes. Evidence and research shows that the organizations who lose most value in a crisis are those that respond in a way which runs counter to their values. So if you remember nothing else, it's respond to the crisis in a way which is in keeping with your values and which is in keeping with the expectations that you have set. And let me give you a quick example of why this is important and why it can actually have a different impact depending on what your values are. So if I think of two airlines, both of them originally based in the UK, Ryanair, low cost, brash, cheap and cheerful, no frills, unapologetically basic. Virgin Atlantic, totally customer focused, love their customers, wrap them in care. If we imagine that those two organizations had a major crisis that was related to passengers or customer care, the expectations of how Virgin would respond compared with Ryanair would be significantly higher. If Ryanair responded in a way which was pretty blunt, not that generous, not that warm, it probably would do them no harm whatsoever. If Virgin did that, it could destroy them. So absolutely respond to the crisis in a way which is absolutely epitomizing your values.
Now, your experience has been with large corporations, and the examples we've just been talking about are, again, large or internationally important organizations. But is crisis planning, crisis communications, is it just for the large multinational, or should even the small and medium-sized business be considering professional help?
I would say that crisis management planning is relevant and important for all organizations. Clearly, it needs to be proportionate to the size of the organization and the risks that it faces. The sad fact, though, is that if you're a small business and you have a significant crisis, it is more likely that it could wipe you out than for a big multinational. So, frankly, I also think that some of these techniques and some of the thought processes are very valuable for individuals, almost within their personal life. I don't want to be like a prophet of doom, but planning for the worst case is not a bad thing to do. And I'm kind of on an airline theme now, but when I'm on an aeroplane, I count the number of rows to the emergency exit because I want to know, to be able to feel them. And I know this is, planning for the worst case. But if that aeroplane is full of smoke, I need to know how many rows I've got to go to get out of the emergency exit. But coming back to your question specifically, yes, I think smaller businesses should plan, and that would be simpler less time consuming, and might not even need external support to do that. But work out what your main risks are, develop a plan, a simple plan for responding, maybe pre-draft the letters or emails you might need to send to your customers should a crisis occur. And yeah, do a little rehearsal with your team. It's something that we do. We are a specialist business. We're not a global PR consultancy, but we have a crisis management plan. We rehearse it every year because we're not immune, and it's important that we are ready. One of the things that we did during the pandemic was we also advised many small businesses on a pro bono basis because they hadn't got plans. Clearly, they hadn't got plans. Many big businesses hadn't got plans, and I know that on the back of that, many of them have now invested time, if not money, in planning more broadly for crisis. So yeah, but it needs to be proportionate. You don't need to spend lots of money on it, but do think about it.
Indeed, absolutely. And I certainly know now that I will be counting the rows of seats between me and the exit the next time I fly, which is sort of bad news because I'm already a paranoid flyer. I worry about everything. But
it's very, very safe, David.
One last question, and that is the question for crisis comms specialists. So it seems to me that there's the potential for burnout. You know, communicators are expected to be on. So how do they handle that, particularly in a crisis situation like the ones we've mentioned that have resulted not just in damaging a business for some period of time, but the loss of life? That's a lot to handle, isn't it?
It really is. It absolutely is. At a practical level, it's really important that people on a long-lasting, or even a crisis that lasts more than 48 hours, there has to be a shift system. People can't work non-stop for day after day after day. They will do themselves harm, and they'll be making worse decisions anyway. And the challenge often is that people want to work non-stop. They don't want to stop putting the effort in. So sometimes people have to be told to stop work. And so that's why it's really important to have deputies assigned and pre-identified to give the A team, the first team that responds, a break. So there are practical things that can be done. And again, a little plug for another really interesting resource for those interested in crisis communication. There's a BBC podcast called 13 Minutes to the Moon. The second series tells the story of the Houston We Have a Problem mission. And in one of the episodes, when the crisis first emerges and the craft is stricken, Gene Kranz, who was in charge of mission control, says, guys, we need to take a break now. They've been absolutely focused on saving their astronauts. They want to keep working, but as the leader, he knows that if they keep doing that, they're going to make mistakes. And he says, guys, we need to take a break now. They all went to bed and their deputies moved in. Looking at this in the longer term, those involved in crisis response can suffer trauma and mental health issues by their involvement. And I actually know someone who was involved in the MH370 response, and I know how draining it was for him to be part of that. So it's important that not just the families are given pastoral care and support, but absolutely also those that are involved in the crisis response. It's recognized that this is a emotionally and mentally very challenging role to play, and they need to be cared for as well. So again, David, it's a great question. And I talked earlier on about people being, one of my motivators to be in crisis communication, and whether it's the stakeholders who are affected by the crisis, whether it's the leaders of the organisation or those who are involved in the crisis response, people always are at the heart of crisis communication, and we must never forget that.
Absolutely. It's a people industry, communications. Jonathan, look, thank you very much for your time and sharing that insight into crisis communications.
Thank you, David.
That was Managing Director of Insignia and internationally regarded crisis communications expert Jonathan Hemus. You've been listening to Conversations on Communication, a Coffee Creative production brought to you in collaboration with the University of Queensland. Production support from Awena Gann and Jaslyn Tan. I'm David Gilchrist. Thanks for listening.